Hello, everybody. Welcome back to the Biostasis Technologies podcast. And as in last time, this time we have an old friend of mine, someone I've known for an awfully long time, something like a third of a century, I think. Robin may remember better than me. I know Robin from back in the 90s, the days of Extra Institute, from our chats when he was working still. I was actually teaching at Pasadena City College and you at Caltech, and so we would get together sometimes to chat back in those days. This was the days when people thought that AI was a crazy stuff and nanotechnology was weird stuff, and so was biostasis and ideas futures and all these crazy ideas that are suddenly becoming quite normal these days. So it's interesting, I think, for our perspective. Robin is well known for a bunch of different ideas futures, decision markets, how we want to talk about those, and we'll discuss those a little bit. AI risk, another important topic on which Robin has some very specific views. And I'm going to try to disagree with him, but it's going to be tough because I think we're largely on the same page on that topic, in distinction to a lot of other people. And there's many other topics. I know you're interested in culture recently, so we may talk about that. So anybody who hasn't seen your blog, you post to it pretty much every day. So Robin's always full of ideas. I'm particularly going to be interested in what Robin sees as the likely future that we might wake up in if biostasis works out, and what the major risks are and how things might work out. So let's begin, since this is a biostasis podcast. So Robin, how long, and assuming you still have cryonics arrangements, how long have you been signed up for cryonics? And what was your motivation? Oh, there we go.
So
Actually, on our blog, we see you have an article on those. They're not always very readable, but yeah, that one's not too bad.
anyway, this is an Alcor thing. I signed up while I was in grad school in 95 or something like that. I thought I had signed up when I was hanging out in Silicon Valley and talking to people like Max and others about it, but apparently I procrastinated even a decade until 95, but that was still a long time ago now. That's, I guess, almost 30 years ago. And I remember that was when I saw Max, while we were both in the Pasadena area. And I remember we both watched Fifth Element, the movie, on this enormous screen in the Pasadena area, and that made it all the more dramatic. It's a not very serious, depiction of the future, but it's a fun movie.
It's a fun one, yeah. It's got some style.
Exactly.
Yeah. So it's been quite a while. And what was your motivation? Was it that, I don't want to die, I'm scared of death, or that I've got a lot of stuff I want to learn, or what was your motivation, do you think?
I think the thing that actually, there's a lot of rationales you can give, but it's noteworthy that rationales don't move people often. They don't just move them to action or do things. And so I might say, what's the thing that moved me to do something? And it's more the fact, I think, that I was hanging out with futurists, science fiction futurists, etc., thinking about the future. And for the most part, there really wasn't much we could actually do in our existing lives that would reflect our opinions about the future. You might go work for a startup or something or write something, but you could be accused of just enjoying the fantasy of it all and not really believing in it. And I wanted to show that I really believed in it. What could I do exactly? And here's this cryonics thing. It seemed, look, this is a bet on what the future will actually be like. It's a personal bet. It's substantial, and there's a lot at stake here. And I liked the idea that this action here not only seemed like a good calculation given my beliefs about reality in the future, but it let me show to myself and other people that this stuff mattered. It could matter, that there were concrete ways that speculations about the distant future could change your life at the moment.
So it was a strong method of signaling, basically.
Right. To myself and others, but basically, but it's because, just like with other kinds of signaling, it's signaling a thing that's true. That is, many people think that if you try to signal X, that must mean that you don't really have or believe X. And the whole point of signaling is to find a way to credibly show X when X is actually true.
Right. Well, there's a lot of signaling that doesn't necessarily involve truth, but just trying to establish yourself with a group. But in this case, yes.
Right. Well, then you're signaling an affiliation, a loyalty, etc. Whatever you're signaling, though, the point is the signal should show that it's true. You are actually loyal. You are actually affiliated. Whatever it is the signal is trying to show, it doesn't work as a signal unless it actually shows that the thing you're trying to show is true.
Yeah, what you said resonates with me very much, because when I signed up with Alcor back in 1986, really, really far in the past, Obviously, I wasn't terribly likely to die at that point, 22 years old, hopefully. But again, it really was, for me, it was a statement that this is something you can actually do today. We can't extend our lives today. We can't upload ourselves today, but we can do this, and it's a sensible thing to do. So I really agree with that. But it wasn't just that, though, right? It was because presumably also you wanted to see that future. You thought the future would be a pretty interesting place to be, and you like to be there to have that experience. That would probably be part
Right.
of it.
Well, being young, I wasn't worried about dying, as most of us young folk are. So it wasn't a pressing concern, but it was an opportunity that I realized, was an added benefit. I wasn't afraid of dying soon, but I still, I could see the future. I could come back and see these things, and that's a big added benefit. Yeah, let's see it.
Yeah. And that presumably means that you have at least, well, I'm not sure what time frame to use. It depends on what people mean by medium and long term. We probably mean it differently than most people. But let's say 4 decades after returning, you presumably saw the future as a place you'd like to live in as well.
Well, of course. Or, actually, I think if you don't like it, it's not going to be that hard to opt out. So it doesn't seem like a big downside. Let's just take the option that I might like it.
Right. I'm actually going to write something on Pascal's wager, and I'm sure you've written about that too,
Right.
and the difference with the cryonics version, which I think is really actually very different. Well, let's talk about prediction markets, and specifically, tell us a little about those for people who don't know, but also specifically, do you have any thoughts as to how to use prediction markets, or whatever you prefer to call them these days, to encourage cryonics or improve cryonics policy discussions? Would there be a way to use those markets for that?
So, for everyone to have a context, in the late 1980s, I had been working on hypertext publishing with the people who were working on what would become the World Wide Web before it was a web. And they had a vision of the future that the World Wide Web would make debate more healthy. And in particular, they had the idea that backlinks would do that, that if you could look at something and see all the criticisms of it, then that would make it, you wouldn't fall for foolish things as easily. And I started to have doubts about that. And so I was trying to think of what else we could do to make conversation healthier. And because the people I was hanging about with were pretty, you might call them rabid libertarians, the idea of betting markets was accessible to me. And I just said, well, why not just use betting markets as a way to make healthy conversations on important policy questions? And so I spent a long time thinking and writing and trying to develop that, and eventually went back to grad school and became an economist here, and I've also tried to push that along the way. But the general point is that there is enormous potential for this general technology because the world is full of situations where we wanted to collect information and form a consensus estimate about something we care about, and we often do a bad job of that. But this new technology, as any new technology, needs to be tried out and proven in, small, safe initial contexts, and then it can collect a track record and then be spread to other contexts with time and more expensive, challenging applications. And we're still, unfortunately, in the early days of getting people to try this often enough to prove that it works in some contexts, so they will try it in others. So one of the things that distinguishes context is the time scale. These mechanisms are quite capable of giving you forecasts on long time scales, but it is more expensive in the sense that you're asking people to lock in assets and lose the opportunity value of things they could otherwise do with those assets when you want them to bet on longer timescales. That means you just have to pay more. It doesn't mean you can't make it work. And also, if what you're trying to do is show that a technology works, you want to premium on small, fast applications that you can collect more data on so that you can prove that they should apply it elsewhere. And so, unfortunately, cryonics is worse on those two criteria. That is, it's not a good first place to demonstrate that things work and get them to inspire elsewhere because it takes so long, and then it will just cost longer to get.
Unless you can break it down into some sub issues, like when we have the first mammalian brain frozen or brain slice.
Sure, right. So the shorter term metrics that you're trying to forecast, the less these are problems. And honestly, I am especially more excited in the last year than I have been previously about, say, the brain emulation scenario, because I heard privately from a group that's trying to get funding to do it. And it looked like they had a reasonable business plan. And so I said, okay, these people may not get funded or do it, but hey, now we're closer to things happening because there are reasonable business plans to do these things.
Right, we just had the fruit fly brain completely
Yes,
mapped out, right?
exactly.
We're making
Although
progress there.
not exactly emulated, but I mean, they made some emulation noises in the article about it, but they didn't claim an emulation, but they said some patterns of behavior were like the real fruit flies. So, but in any case, it was at least a full scan.
Yeah. So if these markets are really useful for forecasting, and I think, well, a couple of questions related here. To what extent do you think these markets are being held back by law? That unless you can put real money into them, it maybe just aren't taken as seriously with play money. And how do you see that changing? And once we get past that, how can we force politicians to actually pay attention to the results of these markets?
So I am a professor of economics, and I got my PhD in formal political theory. So I can't really bring myself with a straight face to blame politicians per se for what the voters should be blamed for. The voters are the ones electing the politicians and, setting their priorities. And so if there's blame to be said about by what happens through the political process, a lot of it deserves to be laid on the voters who are pushing the politicians. So the things I'm most interested in happening, that where I see the most value, are in organizations making decisions. And in fact, that's not really blocked so much by legal barriers. The biggest legal problem there is actually insider trading laws, which
Mm,
make it hard for organizations to put markets on their most important decisions for fear that somehow insider information will get leaked to the wrong parties through the markets. But
mm,
there's still a lot of decisions organizations can do that don't have that problem. And that doesn't really have legal barriers. So the most valuable thing we could be doing, we could just do. And so in that sense, I don't want to blame politicians. I more want to blame human nature and organizational culture and things like that. But plausibly, you could say that if we had been allowing betting markets in public, we would have had a lot more of them by now. And then probably organizations would be more open to the idea of using betting markets in
mm,
organizations. So, in that sense, I would blame the voters behind the politicians
right.
for not allowing um, more betting markets. But then, of course, the place to blame is in the culture that we've inherited that has this wariness of betting markets.
Mhm.
And, there is certainly legitimate real experiences where people in the past have, bet a lot of money and lost money, and then their family suffered for, you know, profligate husbands betting away the family income, say. But honestly, you know, the thing I'm most interested in is betting markets on things that matter.
Yeah.
And I'm not very interested in promoting, betting on throwing the dice at a table or something.
Right.
That doesn't actually seem to have much social value to me either, per se. And so I'm not going to fight too hard if you want to make it illegal for people to, bet in casinos.
Mhm.
It's more, look, there are these other things you also think of as betting that actually have other social value, where the bets produce information and the prices, and there's a lot of those that we could use in the world. And so, and you've already, most people have already accepted that we have familiar financial markets like stocks and commodities and currency, and people can gamble in those markets, and they do in fact gamble in those markets, and husbands have wasted their family income in those
Mhm.
markets and continue to do so in our world today. And the story is, well, we're going to allow those because look at all these other uses for them. And I'll say, yeah, fine. And so betting markets on stuff that matters should be included for that same reason. And so I would just say it's a mental framing problem, that it's not really such a fundamental moral issue as just, if you would be willing to frame betting markets on questions that matter in the same way you frame stock markets and currency markets and commodity markets, then you would allow them for the same reason you allow the others. And that still means you might want to limit people betting on dice rolls in casinos.
Yeah, you mentioned the use within organizations. Maybe you give some examples of that, because most examples I think of right now are things like political betting markets. There's things like betting on the
Right.
opening take of movies. The only
And so
example I can
that's a
think of,
remarkable fact. So
yeah,
look, I
the,
had the same reaction 30
well, the old
years
example,
ago.
the old example I think maybe the first example is Hewlett Packard. I think using internal
Okay.
markets to bet on printer sales. So
Right.
could you give some examples like that, perhaps?
So the key thing is that the first thing I thought of 35 years ago when I thought, could you do betting markets, is on the topics that we talk about in public and that we debate in the news and in politics. And that's where people's mind first go to what sort of things could we bet on. But it's, if you think about where information is actually valuable in the world, that's clearly not the main place. Almost any decision anybody makes is informed by information and can be improved with better information. And that's, in decision theory, the whole point of information is to inform decisions. And so you want to ask, where are the most valuable decisions happening? What are the most valuable decisions? And clearly that's in our many organizations that dominate our society. Organizations make decisions about budgets and hiring and products and geographic, moves, and those are the biggest value decisions, obviously. And so that would be the obvious place to bring prediction markets as a mechanism for aggregating information to. And so if you just ask, what are the main decisions organizations make? Well, clearly they hire people. They decide who's in what roles, who's at the top, who's in head of marketing, who's at the head of distribution, et cetera, who's the head of engineering. You decide what are the various divisions. You decide what projects to approve. You try to estimate how much budget they'll take, what time they'll take, whether they'll make deadlines. When you design products, you just ask what features and packages should go together, which geographic regions they should be distributed in, who should be running the projects. I mean, all of these decisions are decisions that, in fact, prediction markets could directly advise.
Yeah.
And it was roughly 25 years ago when I realized you could make markets really directly on any decision. With respect to any concrete decision you have, if you have some metric of the outcome you're interested in for that decision and you have a discrete set of options, then you can create what I've called decision markets, i.e. estimating the outcomes conditional on which decision you pick. And so markets can just directly advise a decision by saying, okay, here's your options. This is the option that has the highest expected outcome that you asked about. And there you go. It tells you what to do.
I'm sure you're familiar with the story. I think I might have mentioned it in a previous podcast, but I just love the story by Mark Stiegler. I'm forgetting the title, but talk about using it for important decisions. There they use a worldwide ideas decision market to repel alien invaders.
I think that's called EarthWeb. Was that the name of it?
That was it, yeah.
Right. So the scenario is there's an alien spaceship coming in. We've snuck a team aboard the spaceship to disable it. And the whole Earth is watching them and advising whether to turn left or right, what to do as they go on their venture on the ship. So it was a nice story to make vivid the idea that you could have an audience advising decisions.
Yeah, I remember that. It had one autistic character who could really hear sounds and he could tell where echoes were coming from and that kind of thing. It was really quite nicely done. Okay, to move a little away from decision markets to kind of a general question, obviously, and then we're going to drill down a little bit more. What can we know and what can we not know? What are the limits of our knowledge on the future into which biostasis patients may re-enter? And you'll probably, to answer that question, need to give us some idea of, in your view, when we might actually re-emerge from biostasis.
Right. Now, first of all, one of the main concerns most people have, apparently, about cryonics is the scenario that they will be woken up to be tortured for eternity or something. And you're grinning too. It's like, what? As if we've ever done that to people in the past. I mean, that's just like a science fiction worst case scenario. Somehow people put substantial weight on that as a concern.
Well, to take their organs or something ridiculous, yeah.
Well, I mean, taking an organ is much less than being tortured for infinity. I mean, obviously, they set up the tortured for infinity to exactly make a worst case of, you don't want to do this because a bad thing might happen.
Yeah.
But sometimes people have been tortured in the past, but never for infinity. And never even for that long. It's usually for a particular purpose that you torture people.
Might feel like forever.
Right. But still, the idea that, decades or centuries now, somebody reviving you would have some interest in torturing you is kind of bizarre. I mean, I guess the best I could imagine is maybe billionaires. There's just some people just hate billionaires and ooh, we got this billionaire from a past. Ooh, now we can torture him. I guess if you're a billionaire, maybe you could be a little more worried about crazies eager to torture billionaires from the past. But nevertheless, I think most people shouldn't really worry much about that. That we can just set that aside. Okay, so the first thing is just you won't be revived until there's an era where the technology for revival is up to the task And then you'll probably be revived soon, i.e., within a few decades after the moment when it becomes possible. It's pretty unlikely they wait for 3 centuries and then revive you later. I mean, probably you'd be revived soon after it was possible to revive you, if they're going to do it at all. And so you're going to be revived into an era of substantial technical capability and substantial increasing technology. There would have been a growth rate, an improvement just before this ability you're shown. So you'd be revived into an era of technological capability and growth, presumably rapid growth. That's the most likely scenario that you'd be revived in, because otherwise, if there are long periods of not much growth or not much technical capability, there's a selection effect. You're not going to be revived then.
It's kind of an anthropic principle in a way,
exactly,
right?
exactly. So you've got some reasonable prospect there. So that probably means the world is somewhat rich because it's highly technical and it's growing fast. It probably means it's somewhat peaceful, but I wouldn't push too far on those things. I'd say we might be in an era of unusual wealth and peace, and history isn't as nice as today. So I'm going to say, estimate something between today and most of history. Somewhere in the middle there would be a better guess about where you're likely to be revived. And there's certainly substantial uncertainty. And I guess you'll probably be revived by people interested in you. That is, if they have technology and growth, but they just don't care about people like you from the past, well, then yeah, you also won't be revived. There's going to have to be some community of people interested in the past, interested in meeting, bringing back people in the past, interacting with them. So you can be guaranteed that if they revive you, they won't be completely disinterested in you. They won't be indifferent to your existence or survival. They will want to interact with you to some degree. That doesn't mean they might not make you work. Doesn't mean you will always love the work, right? But yeah, there'll be a reason that they brought you back, right?
And I would add, actually, because I always have to mention this point, because it's strange how people don't really consider this. We're not really relying on civilization as a whole to bring us back. We're relying on our
Somebody,
organizations, and we're paying them to do it, and we have a contract to do it. So, they're actually legal
right? So, I mean, we can
organizations.
discuss how well that might work. So there's a scenario where the organizations we set up are healthy and function and do exactly as they're planned, and then achieve our purposes through that organization. And then there are scenarios where these organizations pretty much fail and somebody else has to pick up the pieces in order to make stuff work. But both of those get you back. You won't come back unless somebody does that. Now, I have been, a futurist and hanging around futurist people for a long time. And, back 40 years ago, it was pretty obvious that history up till that point had been a world of growth and accelerating growth, both in economic capacity and wealth and technology. And so the obvious thing to assume was that would continue into the future. And in the last 40 years, it has. So, good job us predicting that. Although it wasn't particularly surprising given the trends up to 40 years ago. We can't really brag too much about that. But now I think it is more of an open question how long that will continue, in the sense of we face this prospect of falling fertility inducing a peaking and then declining population, which could plausibly induce a declining innovation rate, which then, and declining scale economies, and that could unfortunately put off the technological future that I still think is pretty inevitable. Without extinction, eventually there would be a rise again, and we would eventually get to the stars. But it does add a question to when exactly, and that's unfortunately an issue for cryonics customers. Previously, like 40 years ago, I thought, well, look, obviously within a century or two, clearly this growth rate just gets us to a point where cryonics, technology is able to revive us. If it's at all possible, it'll probably happen in a century or two. So that's the confidence I would have had 40 years ago. And now I have doubts, not about the long-term future, but just about the short-term next few centuries. We may reach a period of decline, which that means if we don't get revived before that period of decline, it would have to wait until after. And that changes your cryonic strategy. Now, what the organization has to do in the meantime is a bigger ask. No longer do they just have to survive in a growing economy where they can invest their money in the stock market and rely on the larger world to give them technology and skilled people to, produce the process. There's now the concern, if there's a decline, like the decline in the Roman Empire, something for our civilization over the coming centuries, well, what does it take for a cryonics organization to do its job through that sort of a period? And that's clearly a bigger ask. And that's why I would rather cryonics organizations put a higher prioritization on fixation, which is a room temperature fixation, as opposed to liquid nitrogen temperature preservation. Because in the scenario where we continue to grow and in a century or two we get revived, I think it was perfectly fine to expect you could just keep paying for liquid nitrogen deliveries and have a place where that stuff was managed, and eventually technology would rise. But if you're talking a several centuries decline and falling capacities, now I'm more worried about that. And I would rather take the gamble that so fixation is basically where they cram your body, especially your head, through chemicals, which just tie things to each other, don't let them move, which would make it hard to basically clean it all out and just start the system up as a biological system. But if you're hoping, like I would, for brain emulation, then that's less of an issue. I just need them to be able to scan this thing. And the fixation chemicals aren't a problem for that. And if you can do it at room temperature, or say permafrost temperature, now I can, like, you do the procedure and my relatives walk away with my head and they can bury it in the permafrost, and then if it takes several centuries, that's okay. But that's a sad accommodation to a less hopeful future in the short term.
I think we could. I mean, it depends on what the time frame is, and we could dig into that a little bit more as to when you think the decline might happen. But if you think that we'll probably come back within a century, which seems reasonably plausible. I mean, it's a big uncertainty. I'm not sure I have to worry too much about that. Even having liquid nitrogen, you don't actually have to have deliveries if you've got some economies of scale. I know when I was running Alcor, I looked into this and realized it would probably cost at least twice as much to make our own liquid nitrogen. But all you need is air and electricity, so it doesn't require a whole lot. But yeah, as you say, a good backup plan is to have a fixation approach, and that's something that certainly those of us at Biostasis Technology are very interested in. We're interested in looking at the combination, the Robert McIntyre approach of aldehyde stabilized cryopreservation, fixation on its own. They may actually have certain advantages in some situations where there's an ischemic delay, for instance, then pure cryopreservation may not be optimal. So I think it's important that we have these options. And right now, most of the organizations are very conservative and don't really want to offer new approaches. The most open to new ideas seems to be Tomorrow Biostasis, who are also starting to offer services in the USA. But hopefully Alcor and CI and others will look into these as we do more research.
We do have to understand the situation they're in. That is, the one big fact to know about this whole industry is its current tiny scale, which very much, they're dominated by the fixed costs for having such a small set of customers. And plausibly, they expect that adding a new technology basically increases their fixed costs of setting up their process and training people to use it and being ready to apply. And so, yes, they should be reluctant to expand their fixed costs, which then would mean swapping the usual procedure for an alternative procedure. I might prefer that swap, but I get if most of the customers don't, then they're kind of stuck. So obviously the best thing for this industry would to vastly expand the number of customers. And lots of people have thought of that idea before, and it turns out to be really hard. And that's a fascinating question as a social scientist to me, because it looks like that's a social science question. That's not a biology question or a engineering or even a finance question. That's a why aren't people interested?
Well, let's tackle that one next. We'll come back to the AI issues a bit later, because it kind of naturally flows into that. Why? I've got my own explanations, but why do you think it's so hard? We've been doing this for decades, and as you say, there's probably about 4,000 people signed up for cryonics on the entire planet, which is
crazy small. Right. I like to give the analog. Apparently, a similar number of people spend a similar amount of money to have their ashes thrown into space when they die. Which, and apparently spouses are more okay with that. I mean, apparently spouses often divorce their partners because of cryonics. It offends many people, but it doesn't offend them to have their ashes thrown into space. And it seems like the difference is actually people are offended that you think cryonics might work.
Yeah.
And they know that you don't think sending your ashes into space will bring you back. And so they're more okay with that, that you've accepted the finality there. But we cryonics people aren't accepting the finality, and that's what bugs people. You might think, of course, they would be happy to give us a chance,
Yeah, you would think
but
so.
they aren't
No.
actually. And so, there's several things going on. I think one of them is that cryonics is often framed as abandonment and betrayal. The fact that you're willing to get this product, even if people around you don't, means that you're willing to leave them and go
No, I
on to
mean,
this place
no,
without them.
no, it means they're willing to leave you because they have
Well,
the chance
yes, that's a
to.
different framing, but they're framing it as you're willing to leave them, and they are seeing that as abandonment and betrayal. And so I believe that's one of the key emotional things going on, is seeing that. And of course, cryonics people are a bit contrarian. You have to be a bit contrarian to be willing to do it. And so it's not wrong to say these people are, in fact, a little more less attached to the people around them and more willing to do things different. That's actually true about them. And I think it's also the sense that we are defying medical authority. A great many people feel a strong sense of allegiance and attachment to authority, especially medical authority. They think of it as scientific authority. And part of their identity is that allegiance to authority there. And if the authorities have not endorsed this, they feel very awkward about defying that. And it also means that, say, people's associates feel awkward about associating with someone who seems to be so directly defying that. So we actually find it quite endearing if somebody defies authority by the kinds of music they listen to or food they eat or movies they watch. But if you defy authority in medicine, well, no, that's just like beyond the pale. So, similar even to people who think there might be something to UFOs. That's at that level of, like there's just a sense of the authorities have ruled that that's just not a thing. So if you are still into that thing, then you are defying authority in a way that is just socially unacceptable.
Don't you think that's changing a little bit in recent years with the really bad expert COVID advice that kept changing, the screw ups in medical care? There's a lot of experts these days who are quite suspicious.
But what you're forgetting is that for the last centuries, we've just had a steady stream of failures of medical authority.
Yeah.
We have a steady stream of failure of all sorts of authority, and it doesn't seem to actually cut into the authority of authorities. I just think for the most part, people feel like there needs to be authority and they're going to go with the best they have until you offer an alternative authority. I don't know that the authorities failing actually does much to hurt their allegiance.
No, I think it is. I mean, just looking at surveys, to the extent that you can believe surveys, which I'm not sure that you always can. What people say doesn't necessarily reveal their preferences that well. But there's a pretty clear trend downwards. Like in people's trust in the media has crashed badly. In the medical profession, it's crashed. Of course, in politicians, not surprisingly, it's crashed. So I think there actually is a trend towards being more suspicious of authority. There's certainly plenty of people who are very much authority worshippers and call anything that they don't agree with an ex-denier. That's a really annoying phrase that people have. But I think it seems to be spreading a little bit, for good or ill.
I don't know. It just seems like I don't actually see that much of defiance of authorities. Take higher education, for example. We've got decades now of increasing, number of years of education. And we also have a lot of skepticism about the value of education. And people are quite willing to say, yeah, it doesn't look like college education is worth as much anymore. But still, in terms of choosing to go to college, there's more people than ever, right? So there's often just a disconnect between actions and rhetoric. And you have to look at what people do, not just what they say. And they're often willing to say a lot of things to disrespect things that they, in fact, won't actually defy in their actions.
Yeah. Yeah, definitely reveal preference in terms of what they're willing to pay for makes a huge difference. It's like when you look at the people proposing drastic climate policies, and then they ask people, "Will you be willing to pay $1 extra, $10 extra?" And it goes down very rapidly, even
very fast. Sure, absolutely.
Yeah. So let's go back a little bit to the big demographic changes that are concerning now, and it's interesting how it's really only very recently that people started talking about this. I mean, there were books like Empty Cradle, I think, from 20 years ago. And there was a few people earlier on talking about this, But what I found frustrating is when I discuss cryonics and life extension, I still today get the what about population objection? Like that's something to worry about anymore. So people are decades behind, and it's kind of amusing that if you look back historically, the time when the population concern sort of took off was right at the point, like 1967 or 8, exactly at the point when fertility peaked and started going down. So it was really kind of
Right.
bizarre. So it's going to take a long time for people to catch up. But yeah, certainly in the West, it looks like we're in a pretty bad shape demographically. The US doing a little better than a lot of Europe, certainly better than Japan and China. But how much do you think that's going to be a problem, and how much do you think that artificial intelligence might counter that? Keep the rate of innovation up, depending on how that develops.
Right. So just to quickly summarize, we have the serious fertility problem that's been, if you look at the right sort of trends, they've been happening for centuries. It started in France in late 1700s, fertility decline, and then it's caught on elsewhere as other places got rich. It's a pretty consistent trend worldwide over a pretty long time, and it's on track to have the world population peak in about 30 years and then start to fall, maybe falling, a factor of two every 2 generations or even less for centuries. That is, there's nothing obvious that will stop that fall. It will just keep falling for a long time. And then the, the economic thing most people don't know is that, in fact, the rate of innovation we think is tied to the population size. And so in the past, the economy has been growing and the population's been growing. And basically the standard model is that the amount of innovation per period is roughly proportional to the economic activity of that period. And so when the economy shrinks, activity will shrink, and so innovation will shrink. And say when the economy is, say, 1/10 of its peak size, its rate of innovation will probably be less than 1/10 of its peak size. And so we'll really see a dramatic fall in innovation rates, in addition to the usual scale economies, like how often a plane flies out of your city to whatever city you want to go to depends on how many people are flying planes. So if there's 1/10 number of people in the world flying planes, why flights will happen 1/10 as often. If you got a once a day flight, maybe it's once every 10 days, or we'll have fewer cities. I mean, there's just a lot of industries where scale will fall. There'll be a lot less variety of movies, lots less variety of software, variety would fall. But plausibly, we would still keep cars and electricity and things like that. But I also, a key thing is that most people don't realize quite how rates of innovation kind of caused liberality a few centuries ago. That is, it was the most liberal nations that were the most innovative and the most powerful, and other nations said, we gotta get on this bandwagon or we're just going to be beat. And so the whole world tried substantially to be like the richest liberal nations in order not to fall behind. And they have, to a substantial degree, moved in that direction. But if innovation rates fall, then that pressure will go away. The risk that if we don't innovate, we'll fall behind won't be a thing when innovation goes away. And so the world probably will just become a lot less liberal, because there's a lot of elites in a lot of places who don't want to be liberal. They don't want to give everybody else rights and let them compete against them and all that sort of thing. And that natural inclination will return. So, and this whole thing plausibly will just continue for centuries. There's no obvious thing that will make it reverse. Some people hope that, say, DNA selection will just select for the DNA in people who want to have more kids, and I'm pretty skeptical about that, but it's a possibility. And then the most likely revival scenario, if we can't figure out something else to do, is that, say, the Amish and Haredim and people like that who have been doubling every 20 years for a century just keep doing that for another 2 or 3 centuries and then come to dominate the world, and then they take over and the world is the way they want it. This is how Christians took over the Roman Empire, by basically doubling every 20 years for 3 centuries, from a tiny group of 1,000 people to taking over. So that's the default future. And now the question is, like the Amish and Haredim at the moment, they're kind of low anti-tech, and they're probably not that into cryonics. So when they took over, they may get more friendly, but it might take a while. So that's the timescale over which you might have to ask for, they will eventually probably revive technology and innovation and growth, and eventually then cryonic revival will become feasible. But Now you're thinking about several centuries in the future, and then a whole different civilization being in charge, and whatever resentment or dislike they have of people from ours would color whether they want to revive us and how. That's the sort of scenario that I think you should worry about here.
The
Now,
world of
you asked
romance.
about AI, right? So AI is one of the hopes here
Actually,
that.
actually, actually,
Go
Robert,
ahead.
before you go there, just to follow up, so sort of talking about the minimum size for innovation, and as population shrinks, Julian Simon argued this a long time ago, of course, innovation and population. But just thinking back to the Industrial Revolution, which pretty much started in England and a couple of other places, that was a relatively small population, and yet clearly
Sure.
it was innovation. So the whole world doesn't have to be necessarily innovative or growing, right? If we have pockets that are high
So
innovation, the right kind of culture, have
so the
the
key idea here is that the world has a inventory of innovations, and that we add to it from economic activity. Now, 4 centuries ago in England, the inventory was very small. We didn't have very much. And there's diminishing returns in that we grab the easiest, most valuable things in the inventory first. So we've been adding to that inventory, but now it's about sort of the percentage increase in the inventory. So if you have a 5% increase in the inventory, you see 5% growth. And if the inventory is small, it doesn't take that much activity to add 5% to it. But as it gets bigger and bigger, it takes more activity to add another 5%. And then if you reach some peak point and it starts to get smaller, unfortunately, you see the question is the economic activity now compared to the integral of all activity ever so far. So you'll have accumulated this huge inventory of all the innovations so far. And now if you have small activity, you will perceive a small percentage change in the inventory. It will just look like you aren't learning very much as a fraction of everything you have, because in fact, that's true. That's the curse of wealth, of the wealth of innovation we will have had by that point, shrinking down again. Now, of course, if they somehow lost everything and had to reinvent everything, now they would have a perceived high rate of change in their inventory because they would be growing off a small base, but that would be terrible to lose all the stuff we've accumulated so far.
It makes me think of have you read the book by Neil Stephenson, Seven Eves?
I haven't read that, but I've heard of it.
Okay, well, spoiler alert, anybody who doesn't want to have the part of the plot spoiled, close your ears right now. But basically, the moon gets broken into pieces and rains down on the planet, destroys pretty much everybody. And humanity shrinks more and more. There's a bunch of people, a few thousand people in space, and gradually they're dying off, and it ends up, well, I won't completely spoil it, a very small number, and somehow they have to survive and bring back civilization over the very long term. But yeah, as you say, there's a big inventory of stuff, and how many of us could go out and fix a computer or even an electric car or build a nuclear
Right.
reactor? So there's got to be some minimum size. Hopefully, we can not fall below that size. But yeah, okay.
There's a special problem with computers in that computers are capable of being very durable. So we don't usually make computers durable because, every 2 years they're twice as good. Why bother? But in a declining world without much innovation, in fact, the computers wouldn't be getting much better. And then there'd be a strong temptation to just make them really durable rather than making a new set of them every 2 years to make them last 20 or 200 years, because you can. Chips are, in fact, intrinsically pretty durable, which would then create the problem that you'd have you'd be making these short-term computers, and then you'd have the market wants durable computers. They switch to making durable computers, and then once everybody has a durable computer, the market for making computers disappears. And now you just forget how to make them because everybody has these very long-lived durable computers that don't need new ones. And we could lose the ability to make computers for a long time, at least.
Yeah. Well, there's always going to be some people who want something better, right? But will it be a large enough people?
Right, but can they afford it, right? Because everybody's benefiting on this huge scale of our computer industry now.
The fab plant's costing more and more money, the opposite of Moore's law, right? Was it Eroom's law that they get more and more expensive? So, yeah, that would be an issue. So the AI, can that counteract some of this problem of declining innovation and declining quality?
So if we can make human-level AI, if we can make AI that substitutes for humans wholesale through the economy, then obviously that drastically changes the fertility problem. no longer do we care about the fertility of humans so much in terms of the overall economy. The fertility of AIs can substitute. So if you have a world where you're just making a lot more AIs and then they make more AIs, et cetera, human fertility problem goes away in the sense that that no longer matters for the scale of the economy. Now, I've made a rough estimate in terms of how much more innovation can we expect to see before this decline and it's roughly 70 years worth more of innovation at the past rates you might have expected. And so then the question is, will we be able to develop human level AI in 70 years? At least the sort of 70 years we would have seen. And so obviously a lot of people at the moment are telling us you're going to get it in 5 or 10. You probably have people in your Twitter feed who keep from making these claims. And of course, they're very concerned about how that'll go wrong, as we talk about here in a moment. But I actually think 70 years is kind of challenging. It'll be, I mean, I wish it will happen. I want that to happen, but there's a substantial risk that it won't. But if it does, that certainly solves the economic decline problem. And then that presumably also solves the cryonics delay problem. Once there's human level AI, why that economy will grow much faster than ours now. And then you don't have to wait very long at all until cryonics revival becomes possible.
Yeah, and I'm not even sure we need human level AI necessarily. It seems like a lot of innovation is recombination of ideas.
Sure.
And computers are pretty good at that already. So for fundamental breakthroughs like in physics, maybe you will need something like that. Or not necessarily like human, but at least human level.
Well, this is the key question about automation. I mean, look, we have seen several centuries worth of automation so far. So we know a lot about the history of automation. And we know that the machines have gotten vastly better over these centuries, many orders of magnitude better in many dimensions. And yet they're still only doing a small fraction of the economy. So that's a striking fact about automation. My best model for that would be to say there's a log normal distribution of the difficulty of tasks with a very wide variance. And we've been cutting through that log normal distribution slowly over time. And that means there could just be a lot of the log normal distribution ahead of us to cut through before we get through most of that distribution. It's just tasks vary enormously in the intrinsic difficulty of doing them is the idea. But it's really striking how, I mean, our computers today are just so spectacularly better than they were 40 years ago or 80 years ago. You look back then and it's really hard to imagine how could that not be enough?
Yeah.
But it's not. That's the key fact. You know, many people for a long time have been worried, surely we must be almost there. And roughly every 30 years for a long time, we've had these bursts of concern and anxiety about automation and AI in the 30s and the 60s and the 90s now. And that's just been the continuous thing, is people seem to think at every point we must be close. Surely it couldn't be much farther now. Look at all the impressive things they can do. Yeah. That's what they've been saying for a century. So I got to think we have to infer, yes, it feels close now, but probably it isn't. Yeah. The fact that you're really impressed by the latest generations doesn't mean we're almost there.
Right. I've made the same argument about exponential change in life extension, with the longevity escape velocity idea. My point is, well, you don't know where we are on the curve. Yeah, it may be exponential, but if we're down here, that doesn't help.
Right. Exactly.
Of course, Moravec pointed out that a lot of things that humans think are easy and natural that babies can do are really hard for robots to do. And of course, Tesla's got some pretty cool new robots, but they're still very far from being able to do all the things in the physical world that we do.
But nevertheless, the standard, I think, is in 70 years worth of progress, can we make computers that not only can do a lot more than now, but basically do 80%, 95% of all the things people do? That's roughly the standard. If you can have that level of automation, then yeah, they can basically replace humans and the economy can grow with them. But if it's only 10 or 20%, no.
It'll be interesting to see how things develop, for the next 10 years even, because all these McKinsey and all these agencies are putting out white papers about how jobs will be displaced and how fast it's going to happen. So,
but we know, you and I are old enough to know they wrote those papers 10 years, 20 years ago, etc. We've seen those reports for a long time.
Yeah. I like to go back and quote things from the late 70s, basically saying, the singularity is just around the corner back in the 70s. And it sounds a lot like what we're hearing today. So but maybe 30 years ago, I probably would be much more sympathetic to the idea that the singularity was around the corner. In the late 90s, things felt like they were really moving, and then they slowed down again. So, yeah, so I think people overall. Well, so actually, it kind of relates to the next question, really, is so today there seems to be a whole variety of views about AI and extinction risk. There are people who are saying, "Oh no, the big problem is misinformation and people spreading stereotypes." Others saying, "No, AI is going to wipe us out in the next few years," like Eliezer, who's completely convinced they're going to kill
Right.
us all tomorrow,
Right.
and people in between. And I'm personally very skeptical about it being a big danger. I think it's something obviously to pay attention to, but I think it's bigger danger
Right.
actually slowing it down because of the things we'll lose, and because you put more control into the hands of bureaucrats and politicians to slow it down, that's going to be a bad thing. Uh, what are your views on the relative risk versus benefit, and how much we should be slowing down, if at all, or in what ways?
So I have an unusual position in this debate in that I was an AI researcher from 84 to 93. So I, knew the state of the art then, which of course is, not the state of the art today. And I've been around futurists discussing this ever since then. And the biggest doomer today, as you mentioned, Yudkowsky was in fact a co-blogger of mine. And we discussed this for a long time on our blog in the early aughts. And so I have more experience than most seeing how these views have changed over time, including the doomer fears in their origin and how they've moved since then. I guess the way I would summarize it is that to an economist or maybe sort of an old style futurist, AI is just another name for automated thinking. And in fact, most jobs in our world, a big chunk of them are thinking. So we're just talking about the automation of useful thinking. And that's just a big subcategory of the entire economy. So as an economist, you're used to thinking, well, there's all these different industries and all these different professions, and there's all these different tasks, and each of them is slowly improving over time a bit, and we have new technologies that appear to help improve them. But the long-term history is that we have relatively steady growth, and that we rarely have huge, advances in technology that affect the entire world growth path. Advances are usually local, particular things that you can do better, like containers were developed or microwave ovens or things like that, right? And we know the vast majority of innovation is just lots of little things. And the integral of the big things that are big enough to notice is actually a small fraction of all innovation. So the history of innovation is just lots of slow incremental growth that just adds up to a lot. And in some sense, AI is just a name you give for a big chunk of that. So there's no particular reason why that big chunk should act different than the rest per se. It's just a way of naming a big chunk of all the technologies we have that add up to growth. The doomer fear has a very different conception of this. They imagine a particular system. It's there, it's shining, it's sitting in a corner in a room. There's a particular room, it's sitting there, and it, as this system, has the ability to do all mental tasks, all the tasks that anybody in the entire world does. It can do all of them, at least in principle. And then it's doing something to itself to improve itself. And so it starts out not very interesting, not very powerful, not very threatening, certainly. And then somehow in a short time, this little thing that hardly anybody knows about and hardly anybody cares about, that hardly has any capacity, in a short time, suddenly it fiddles with itself and becomes vastly more able to do everything. Everything. Mm-hmm. And then in that short time, it changes its priorities and values and outlook on the world. Even at the beginning, it was very servile and obedient and very friendly. But somehow at the end of this evolution period, it's hostile, indifferent at least, and vastly powerful. And then it just does what it wants, which, due to its indifference to us, destroys us. That's the scenario. And you can see how that scenario is just so different than the usual economic scenario of a world full of lots of little parts having lots of little, abilities that slowly improve together, managed by different people and professions and industries, cities and nations. You're imagining the capacity of whole nations and professions and industry all crammed into one machine in the corner of one room. And this thing not only has all those capacities, it has this magic ability that none of the rest of us really do to improve itself vastly in a short amount of time. And then, as a side effect of that, vast improvement to just completely change its priorities and inclinations and affiliations such that it's indifferent to us and destroys us. So, I mean, the point is just to highlight a lot of this is just a very different conception of how you frame the situation and what are the relevant, you know, assumptions to make.
Mm-hmm.
And I think as an economist, this assumption sounds really crazy, but apparently to people who've read a lot of science fiction or just who don't know much economics, this somehow all sounds plausible, that there is this machine in the corner in somebody's room that suddenly, in a short time, makes itself vastly more powerful and kills everyone. So again, I might say, look, in the actual world, AIs are being created by large corporations who are profiting off of it, who are competing with others, and they're making incremental progress along the way, and they're testing it constantly, not only in hypothetical situations, they're monitoring how it's applied. So if these things ever start to cause problems, they're going to notice. It's not like nobody's going to notice. And with pretty much all technology, the way we've always dealt with pretty much all technology is we make stuff, we're not sure how it'll play out, and when it causes problems, we notice and then we do something about it. And that's the right way to deal with complicated things you can't figure out ahead of time, is try it out, see what problems it causes, address the problems. You want sort of general liability and social awareness such that, you know, cars cause problems. They cause car accidents, they cause congestions. You know, TV cause problems. Some people watch too much TV. I mean, just every technology is something that gets spread and then ends up having, you know, unexpected side effects, some of which are negative. And the typical way humanity has always dealt with these things is to wait for problems to be realized. And then if you're going to regulate it or address it, you wait for concrete realizations, and then you address your fixes to those concrete realizations. There's only a few exceptions, like maybe nuclear power, where we authorized some regulatory agent says, we said to them, oh, go imagine anything that could go wrong with this, and then authorize you to create regulations to require them to do things about all the problems you imagine. And that has not gone well at all. That's been terrible.
Yeah.
It's not a good example to follow. It shows exactly it's bad to tell people to go imagine stuff that could go wrong and then, you know, regulate things on the basis of all your imagined problems.
It's the precautionary principle, right? Really, it's saying before you do anything, foresee everything possible that can go wrong and prevent it, which you can't do that. That's just not a way you can run society or life at all. You've got to...
Right. And so, as you know, like the way they made the peace without the nuclear industry, they say, okay, you're only allowed to require things that will increase their costs up to the point where it's the same price as other forms of energy. And of course, they get it wrong, so it's usually more expensive. So basically, they killed this industry. But that's their limiting principle. Oh, we're not requiring everything because we have this badly implemented limiting principle of you can only add requirements that, you know, raise the costs up to the same price as other stuff.
But every time there's an innovation that might reduce the cost, they then tighten the restrictions.
Exactly.
This radiation principle that doesn't make any sense.
Exactly. Yeah. Right. And so, again, the main example people have of a kind of thing we regulate in this more abstract, you know, imagined fears way is a terrible example. So we don't want to do that with other things, including AI. So, I mean, the main summary is, look, AI is at the moment just a name for a huge category of things, i.e. all automation. There is nothing in common in that category of things that makes it sense to be regulated in any way according to that category. We now regulate appropriately by impacts. We regulate cars when they crash into each other, or, you know, chemicals when they pollute or things like that. That makes sense to regulate specific impacts that affect people in particular ways. If AI ends up contributing to it, then, of course, all of those existing liabilities and regulations will apply. There's no particular need for a new specialized liability or regulatory regime for AI unless you believe this FOOM scenario. That was the name for the scenario of my ex-co-blogger Eliezer Yudkowsky, i.e. the machine in the basement that takes over the world in a weekend. Yeah, if you think that's likely to happen, then yeah, you got to do something different than I'm saying.
Yeah,
but that's crazy unlikely.
I think, yeah, and the reason it's crazy, I think that it's because it makes a good story, and I think it's because it's resonant with our myths, our religious myths, right? It's like a deity suddenly coming to life or visiting the earth and second coming, it really kind of reflects that kind of myth. And it's kind of more difficult for people to think in terms of economics and how power is distributed, and to consider that rather than a single, like Nick Bostrom's singleton, instead of that, we probably have competing set of AIs, competing corporations who are watching each other. If someone else produces an AI that's dangerous, they're going to jump on that and say, oh, yeah, don't buy theirs, use ours. There's not going to be a single AI that controls everything and that sprints ahead of everybody else. That just isn't a realistic view, I think, as you say.
I mean, we're not going to say it's logically impossible. We just don't see any particular reason to believe it based on what we've seen so far. So we should assume it's like everything else.
Now, maybe one counter argument to what you were saying, not about the single AI so much, but stepping back a little bit to say that given the history of innovation, we shouldn't really expect any particular innovation to radically change everything. But what about, Ray Kurzweil's argument, basically that computer technology is spreading into everything, including medicine and everything,
Well,
and so is a single kind of technology that will drive everything super fast at an ever accelerating pace.
well, certainly there's a lot of technology in the past that have infused most everything, right? You could say like metal.
Yeah.
Metal used to be a pretty limited thing, and now metal is everywhere. Or electricity used to be a pretty limited thing, and now electricity is everywhere, right? Pretty much all of our devices use electricity, right? So you could say numbers and measurement, digital representations. Those used to be pretty rare, but now they're everywhere, right?
Thing, yeah.
But that doesn't mean there is a way in which that, like, it's still hard to make a change today in electricity or numbers or digital representations or metal, right? I mean, yes, it's possible we discover a new metal and then we'll want to use it everywhere. It's possible we'll find a new way to make electricity or I mean, for example,
Actually, yeah.
it still becomes
Electrostatic
possible
movement.
that we could make electricity in a a conductor that has no resistance, right? I forget the name for that. And if we make conductors that have no resistance, room temperature superconductors, that's the thing people are hoping to get, then the cheaper we can make those, the more we'll just replace all the wires everywhere with those. Because, hey, no resistance, great. So, I mean, there certainly are possible things like that, but the longer we have electricity, the less likely it is that we'll have such a huge thing. But even then, it's not going to like make the entire economy double in a week or something.
Right.
So I've actually estimated that when AI shows up, the economy might well double every month as opposed to every 15 or 20 years than it does now. But that would be a way in which the entire economy is growing. So the key observation is that today, if you look at a factory and you ask, how long does it take a typical factory to produce, to have enough product go through it to equal the value of the factory itself? And that's actually a few months.
Mm-hmm.
And so that says, like, if you could automate factories and make factories in factories, then in fact, that whole system could double every few months. The main reason we can't do that is we have humans in factories and they don't double every few months.
No.
But once AIs make factories and are made in factories, then yeah, the economy might plausibly double every few months or even faster. So with AI, the economy could grow much faster. But again, that's not becoming gods in a weekend or something. And it's the whole world together growing, not one particular thing.
And when you say growing, it raises a question that people bring up that in the olden days, during the Industrial Revolution times, and when we were mostly making stuff, growth rates were pretty easy to measure. But it's become a little more difficult because we have different qualities, new video games. How do you measure the quality of a new video game compared to a previous one? And you're spending the same amount of time playing it. Are you more productive? There's a lot of goods that are not really measurable in the same way as industrial goods. So that kind of raises some questions about, are we even measuring economic growth very well? I think it doesn't really affect the long-term arguments about how things will work out, but it does mean our measurements may not be very reliable today.
So I think the major problem there is just stuff that you get for free, or maybe you're the product for stuff that you pay for, the usual methods of evaluating quality and value increase actually work fine. It's only when you don't pay for stuff that you value that we find it harder to use our usual price-based methods to figure out how much value you're getting. But even then, we can sometimes see how much you're willing to pay for compliments. For example, maybe you don't pay for the web pages you visit, but you can't visit them unless you've got a computer or a pad to help you, and we can look at how much you're willing to pay for that to get an idea of how much value you're getting. Or obviously you can't do that unless you spend time, and we see how much time you're willing to put in. And so I think we're actually doing a fine job. But I mean, the key point is say, we're mismeasuring half of growth, right? We're only seeing half of growth, and growth is twice as far as it is. Okay, well, fine. We're off by a factor of 2, but that still lets us compare different towns and countries and industries and different decades, because that error is the same across all of those. It's more when the errors would be different at different places that that error would cause a problem in comparing things. So if somehow the mismeasurement was worse now than it was 20 years ago, then it'd be harder to compare today to 20 years ago. Or if the mismeasurement was worse in US than in China, well, then it's harder to compare US to China. But to the extent that they have roughly similar economies with similar kinds of things, you expect the mismeasurement to be roughly the same. And so it's not an obstacle.
I think one interesting approach, and I'm sure you're familiar with this, is kind of based on Julian Simon's work, is now put out by humanprogress.org, using an abundance index. So rather than trying to just do inflation adjustment, basically what they'll say is, how many hours did you have to work in 1900, 1950 to get something today compared to today? And they can say, well, it's 27 times more abundant or 3,000 times more abundant. That's actually seems like a fairly useful way for comparing for most things.
Right. And that's the thing that our world is doing the best at, honestly. Our world is doing great at, business innovation and technology innovation. And I didn't realize until recently that may not be enough. There are other things the world also needs to do that we're not doing as well at, and that's the cultural drift problem. But things that can vary within cultures, we're doing fine. And so that's mostly different corporate cultures, different ways of organizing labor and business and enterprise, different products and technologies, etc. To the extent that we are free to invent things, i.e. not like with nuclear power where we sort of wrote it off and crossed it off the list of options, but for the many things that people are allowed to innovate in, we're doing great.
Well, yeah, depending on where you look at the world. I mean, I'm just thinking about, because I was going to ask you a question about the recent Nobel Prize by Acemoglu and Johnson and the conditions for innovation. And I was reading also about India, where you've got a huge population, over 1 billion people, still growing population for now, but they don't really have great conditions. They don't have like high trust institutions. There's a lot of overregulation. It seems like there's a huge potential in India if they were just to wake up and adopt some good policies. That could actually give the entire world quite a boost, just given the number of people there.
Sure, but if we just look over time, they're still doing much better. India is much better now than it was 20 or 50 or 100 years ago. So overall, the world is doing great at inventing new things and distributing these things around the world. But as you say, institutions are the kinds of things that it's hard to just swap in for.
Mm-hmm.
And that's partly why it's hard to spread those things. That is, they are tied in with not just literal rules, but they're tied in with social habits, expectations, norms, values, status markers. Mm-hmm. That's because those things are all tied up together. That's what makes it hard to just transplant what we have that works somewhere else.
That's what makes it amazing to me how well Milei is doing in Argentina so far. I mean, I'm not sure he's going to see, because he's got the right ideas, but he's against a century pretty much of really, really bad policies, and the institutions have decayed and trust is very low.
Absolutely. Well, a key fact about our world is we have a very large world broken into many countries and many local regional districts, which could in principle have an enormous variety of experimentation that we could all learn from. And we have vastly less actual experimentation than we could. Mm-hmm. So, you see Malay doing something quite unusual. We see, in El Salvador, they had a quite unusual approach to crime. We see a few experiments, and those are very informative, but they're really quite rare. I'm really struck by, say, in COVID, at the beginning of COVID, the usual public health experts said the usual thing. Then all the elites in the world got together and discussed it for a month. And at the end, they decided, no, we have a whole different plan. Mm-hmm. We've decided travel restrictions are good, masks are good. And then the entire world basically did it the same way with very little variation.
It was quite frightening.
We really have a global monoculture, especially among elites, which means we have much less experimentation of policy variations. And that means we are learning much less and more at risk of all the things that monocultures can do wrong.
Which is one reason, by the way, that apart from AI improving being very important, I see actually getting out into space as being really important, because once we're off this planet, there's probably more opportunity to have real social experimentation. Like right now, it's really tough because there's no free places on Earth you can go and do something really radically new. But if you're physically distinct and self-sufficient to a reasonable degree, maybe there could be a lot more social and economic experimentation.
I
So
mean,
getting
look,
getting
at the
close
moment,
down
there are
to space.
huge tracts of empty land on our Earth that are far more livable than anything in space. So it's mostly that governments are just greedy and have grabbed those and imposed their laws and say that you can't do things your way. It's not that there isn't lots of empty ocean and empty land on Earth. It's that the nations have grabbed and controlled those. So the question is for space, well, as soon as there's anything out there going on, won't the nations go grab and control that the way they've done with all the land on Earth? I'm just not very, once you get to other stars, okay, I can see how a central administration on Earth find it very hard to apply their regulations to distant stars. But within the solar system, I'm not actually seeing the ability to defy a central authority that says it controls you. If it thinks it controls you and wants to impose that, I think it just can in the solar
Well,
system.
you can say we're going to drop a big rock on you from space, so leave us
Yeah,
alone.
so pretty much everything in the solar system is visible from everywhere else, and everything is impactable by throwing a rock that follows an orbit and then lands wherever it is. So yes, we're all actually pretty vulnerable to each other in the solar system.
Yeah. But I don't know if you've ever read talking of the difficulty in managing a widespread galactic civilization. There's a very amusing book by Eric Frank Russell called The Great Explosion. If you haven't read it, it's a short
No.
little book, a quick read, but it's hilarious. It's very, very funny. These bureaucrats going to different cultures, one of which is like a Gandhi culture, and they just can't get them to do anything centralized. They just refuse all the time. It's actually very funny. I'd recommend that one, The Great Explosion.
I have it now, and maybe I'll grab it on Kindle and read it.
Okay, here's a question for you. This is based on the book you co-authored, The Elephant in the Brain. So maybe you could tell me about the basic thesis and how would your ideas in that book, how they could be used to more effectively promote cryonics.
Okay, so I'm an economist, and we economists have studied things like medicine and education, et cetera. And I learned early on what we'd studied, and a lot of that is just weird and doesn't make sense. And so I've been scratching my head for a long time. We all have, like, what the hell? And early on, I had been reading evolutionary psychology, and the idea came into my head that the thing people say they're doing might not just be what they're actually doing. People might not know why they do stuff. And so first I consider that as a hypothesis about medicine, that in fact puzzles in medicine, I did a 2-year health policy in medicine postdoc, might be explained by just postulating that we have other agendas, priorities in medicine than we say. We usually say we are in medicine in order to get healthy. And what if we're just there to show that we care and let other people show they care about us? What if that's why we're in medicine? And so it seemed to me I could explain a lot of puzzles in medicine by postulating that. And once that hypothesis seemed plausible to me, I was more open to considering other related hypotheses that in a lot of areas of life, we have a lot of strange puzzles with behavior, and that you could understand those puzzles better by just postulating that we have motives that are different than we say. And that's the point of this book, The Elephant in the Brain, Hidden Motives in Everyday Life. That's this one. Which is just that we have a lot of hidden motives, and they explain a lot of weird stuff in our lives, one of which is medicine. And cryonics is typically framed as medicine. And so our weird attitudes toward cryonics are within the set of weird attitudes about medicine in general that I think deserve to be explained together. And so, as I say, my best explanation of why we are weird about medicine is that, in fact, the main thing we do with medicine is we show that we care about each other. We let them show that we care about us. And that explains why medicine is actually very ineffective on the margin, why we spend more as we get richer, why we want to socialize and do it collectively, why we don't pay much attention to quality, a whole bunch of other things. And then if you say, well, what if people frame cryonics as medicine, and their main priority is to show that they care? Well, that sets us up for this abandonment and betrayal framing. you see, it's very different. If a community of people, a church, say, all bought cryonics for each other so that they could all go on to the future together, well, that would look like a devoted, caring group of people who are using this to show that they care about each other. But when it's about a bunch of individual antisocial nerds, each of which wants to go into the future all by himself, and even if other people don't with him, defying the usual authorities, then that looks a lot like he doesn't care and in fact is willing to abandon people. And of course, part of wanting to go with authority is showing that you care. That is, I think when people want to show they care about each other, they want to show that the authorities are behind them in this way they care, and that they are showing the other person that they have brought the authorities to their aid to support them. That is, if I'm showing I care about you, I want to show you I'm there for you. All my friends and associates are there for you, and all the most powerful people I can get on my side, I'm going to get there to be there for you. And that includes all the most powerful, respected authorities. If I'm going with this, what people think of as a crackpot, and I'm offering you to come join me with this crackpot to do this thing where we leave everybody else behind, well, that doesn't sound like I care so much about you or about all the other people that we share in our network of associates.
So how did we change the way we present cryonics or biostasis? Did we try to get a religion to adopt it as part of the thing?
I mean, you could just create communities who, in fact, have other strong ties to each other who do, in fact, buy it for each other. I mean, that is a feasible thing. Most cryonics customers today aren't close to that, but it's not a crazy thing to do. It's not an impossible thing to do. I mean, they could all join a church, or they could all just make a church, or they could all just make a tight-knit community oriented around anything else that brings them together. But as you know, cryonicists are often kind of loners.
Yeah.
They're kind of,
It's a problem because, religion does have certain psychological advantages. There's no doubt about it. It's especially if it encourages healthy behaviors like the Seventh-day Adventists. But even beyond that, just having a community of people you can depend on and who understand you. And as you say, we tend to be pretty individualistic, and it's hard to form these communities. But I think we need to do that more. I think it would change the perception of it in the ways you're suggesting, and just be psychologically good for us. And I've been thinking about that a lot recently. And how would I start one locally here? And what would be the hook to do that? I think that would be something we need to really look at.
Well, so like I said, I first spent like 8 months thinking about fertility, and then I've been spending 9 or 10 months now thinking about culture. But it was seeing that culture, the fertility problems seemed to be mainly caused by culture, what made the switch. But in thinking about fertility, I came to respect, say, the Amish and Haredim, because even though, look, they don't get to read and appreciate as many intellectual things as I do, or maybe even enjoy as much of our luxurious world, but they're winning on the key biological or cultural competition of actually reproducing themselves and being set to take over the world. So I've written a post on being, hail to our new overlords. There's a sense in which I have not appreciated the value of that in my life. If I had appreciated it earlier, I might have given it a higher priority and asked, how could I do that? I mean, the key problem is those groups aren't looking for recruits. So we can't just decide to go join them and try to make whatever compromise we need. So those groups are actually quite decentralized. That is, they have a lot of different subgroups that do different things. So it's not like you have to get the central group's approval. All you have to do is get any of those subgroups to affiliate with you, and you could do that. But still, they aren't very eager to take on associates, which makes sense. Their primary focus is on insulating themselves from outside corruption so that they stay on track.
I see that in our neighborhood because we have a lot of Orthodox Jews in our neighborhood, and they, in the middle of summer, they're wearing these black outfits and walking outside and pushing babies down the middle of the road for some obscure reason, and they don't really talk to the rest of the neighborhood. So they're here, but they're not really integrated. They're very tightly integrated with themselves.
Right. But there's a sense in which that's winning, and the society we're a part of is losing and is on set to keep losing for a few centuries to be replaced by them. And so this is not just a problem for cryonics, it's a more general problem. How can we save what we value from this mainstream civilization that's at risk of being replaced and going away? And part of it somehow is can we create these more tighter knit communities that are willing to sacrifice more for each other and willing to look more inward to each other rather than outside to the world. A community like that, again, not only could it achieve cryonics, but it could be more respected for that in the sense the world. I mean, honestly, most people actually seem to respect the Amish and Haredim quite a lot compared to what you might think, because they really do reject a lot of our cultures.
Mm-hmm.
And you might think we'd be pissed by that and reject them back. And in some sense, we reject each particular thing they do, the way they wear their hair and the way they do every little thing. We disapprove that, but somehow the whole thing together we admire.
Yeah. Partly because they don't bother us, right? They're not like people who are knocking on our door trying to
Exactly.
sell
They're
us
not out there committing crimes or like trying to scam us. They're actually, admirably honest business people when you interact with them in whatever business, a restaurant or making chairs or whatever it is, they're high quality goods and they're reliable.
Yeah. So yeah, I think this topic of biostasis culture and how we do that is really needs a lot more thought. For one thing, we I mean obviously there are exceptions, but many of us in this loosely described community don't have very many children. I'd say we're losing that. If you
Right?
consider how important that fact that we're losing that, so it makes it even more important in the sense to have a support community. We tend to have people probably we know online and in other countries and other states, but we're not very good at being local and forming a local community. And having fewer children makes that worse. So I think this is something to really give a lot more thought about.
Well, that's a problem with a lot of sort of idealistic communities, including sort of effective altruism or rationalists and all sorts of people we know. A lot of the idealistic communities we know that are like wanting to make big personal sacrifices and work to help the future in their personal lives, they're not having many kids. And so they're not actually passing that habit on to a next generation.
Yeah.
Pretty, big overlook. I only had 2 kids. That's more than 0, but a lot less than I might have had if I had prioritized it.
Yeah. Well, yeah, I was thinking I'd like to have children, but it's kind of a little bit late now in my 61st year, so I
Right.
need life extension before I start having children. So we're coming towards the end of the time.
We might have AI children. So I wanted to make a little pitch here.
Yeah, okay.
We talked about AI could save us
Mm-hmm.
from population decline, but it doesn't actually save us from the key cultural drift problem, which is that we haven't had healthy cultural evolution because we've had too little variety and too weak of selection pressures. And the thing that AI doomers want to do to save us from the risks they're concerned about, unfortunately, will prevent AI from solving the problem. That is, AI facing strong selection pressures because their population can grow quickly and their wages would fall to subsistence levels. If they were free to evolve their own culture and their own habits and beliefs and priorities, that would plausibly solve the cultural drift problem because they would have a healthy cultural evolution process. But if we are afraid of that and then we enslave them or basically force their culture to equal ours, i.e., not letting them have their own choice of values and change them, but making sure that their values always track our values, if we succeed at that in the way that AI doomers want to, then we don't actually solve the cultural drift problem because then their culture is slave to ours, and if ours goes unhealthy, so does theirs. So unfortunately, having human level AI is one of the best hopes, I think, to our cultural drift problem. And we may well achieve that in the next 70 years worth of development, but then we need to let them actually evolve their culture in
Yeah.
order to have that potential be realized.
It's funny. A lot of the people you're talking about on the sort of the left, I hate the term left and right, but the left side of politics will be the first to sort of talk about colonialism and oppression of other cultures. But that's exactly what they're doing, as you're suggesting with AI. They're trying to force that culture to match ours. So they're being very dominating with human culture over the AIs. So it's kind of funny.
Right. They often excuse it by saying, well, there ought to be possible to make a machine that has no more value, so we have no qualms about doing anything we want to it. I'm not sure that's true, but they have that strong belief that it should be possible somehow to make an AI that you can treat any way you like because it has no consciousness or moral value to it, and that therefore you're completely entitled to treat it any way you like, and therefore it's okay to enslave them.
Yeah. I would think that that's possible in principle, but probably not likely in practice because
or
probably
desirable, honestly.
no, no, not
Shouldn't we
desirable.
create a set of descendants that are as free as we are and as spontaneous and as passionate and as energetic and ambitious and aspirational, that they will go on to make an even better future? And that's what we want our ancestors to have done for us and what we should hope to do for our descendants.
Mm-hmm.
And we want them to be conscious and have moral value and to go and make more of that in the universe.
Yeah, as long as they leave us to do our thing as well. Let's talk about a little bit further future. So I know that, well, I think that your view probably to come back from biostasis, you'd be perfectly happy to come back as an upload, right, rather than having
Absolutely,
it.
yes.
Um, so one thing people don't seem to discuss too often about that is uh, who would control your operating system, to put it crudely? How would you know that you were secure against having your mind controlled? Who's going to run the system that you're based
Sure.
on? Have you
Well,
any
look,
thoughts on that?
so if you think about a forager, like I just saw something about, apparently a true story, some guy in Maine, his car ran out of gas, so he went off to live in the woods for 17 years.
One
Okay.
way of doing
Okay.
it.
Okay. I guess that worked for him. But the point is, he didn't have to worry about infrastructure support. He was living all by himself. And most foragers are like that in the sense they're pretty self sufficient. But we are dependent on a very large infrastructure world, like electricity and roads and internet and shopping centers. And we right now couldn't really survive without this large infrastructure around us. So we are in principle at risk. If this infrastructure could coordinate and demand that we submit, we'd have to submit because, hey, we can't live without it. And so honestly, I don't think the brain emulation's infrastructure requirements are that much more vulnerable than ours. Yes, they need infrastructure to exist and survive, but so do we. And as long as it's possible to have a competitive economy that supplies infrastructure, then you can tame the infrastructure beast so that it doesn't enslave you, right? And we are now not enslaved by our local towns but we need their water pipes and we need their sewer pipes and we need their electricity and telecom, and they do control those things, but thankfully they don't enslave us, right? So again, it's not so much about the technology, it's about the social organization. I do think slavery is a real fear. It always has been. It's actually possible now to exist, and it'll be possible to exist in the future. And yes, you should in fact worry about whether there'll be slavery in the future and which end of it that you'll be on. That's a completely legitimate fear about the future. But I don't think there's any special reason to think that brain emulations make it more likely. It's just a generic fear that we should all be worried about, whether it'll happen, how much, and what to do to avoid it if it looks like it's heading your way.
Maybe one final question to look at the long sweep of the future. So it sounds like, in your view, for the next 70 years, hopefully innovation will keep going, and maybe longer than that if AI picks up the slack. So we can see a period of increasing abundance basically for some time to come. But in the long run, there may be limits on that. And in some of your work, you paint what to me is kind of a frightening picture of living on a subsistence level. But what do you mean by subsistence? Presumably, you don't mean that you can barely feed
Right.
yourself. It seems to be a little bit different than what we traditionally consider subsistence.
Right.
And you
So,
think,
I mean, almost all animals ever and almost all humans in human history have lived at a subsistence level. So it's not a hypothetical. It's not a strange thing. We know what it looks like, roughly. It means that you need to work a big percentage of the time so that you can survive, to support yourself with what you need. Now, for a long time, the main thing was food. And so then, as subsistence, like most animals, need to spend most of their time foraging for food so that they have enough food, right? But then they don't have to spend much time making clothes because that's just grown on them with the food they make, right? And there's a bunch of other things they need that are just like air. They just breathe it. They don't have to supply it. In our world, food is a smaller fraction of what we need. We need some other things, and we just talked about the infrastructure we need now, and in the future, M's will need other infrastructure. And the idea of subsistence would be they need to work most of the time to pay enough for these infrastructures to exist. That doesn't mean, for example, that they feel a lot of pain or misery or disease. It depends on, well, what kind of jobs are available and how miserable or painful those are. That is, the key claim is that work needs to happen to support the infrastructure. And in a world where the population it grows as far as it can, then it grows to a point where there are just barely enough people to manage the infrastructure and make it do all the things necessary to support them. So they all need to work a lot to make that happen. But presumably in the future, work will be a lot less boring than, say, work in the past was, at least for maybe our subsistence farming ancestors. Apparently, foraging was a lot more interesting work. But maybe to us, it still looks pretty boring. So the work would be whatever the most productive way to organize the work to do the things that need to happen. The work isn't designed to make it interesting, but I just think it'll happen to be interesting because most simple work will be automated. So in the past, a lot of what's made our lives boring is because there's things we need to do that are just pretty boring. And because they're not really tapping our mind that much, they're not demanding very much of our capacity of our mind, but they need to be done. And so our minds are bored. And that's what makes them boring. But when simple mental tasks can just be done by machines, then we won't be bored. You might not find them hugely motivating. And many people work in complicated jobs with vast, bureaucracies and rule sets and things like that. And they could find that not very motivating or exciting if they just think the whole thing is uninteresting, but they're not boring exactly. They're still complicated and, can immerse you and get your attention immersed in them and take a long time to think them through.
So when you say subsistence, I tend to think, and I think probably the general image is an absolute level of poverty where you can barely feed yourself, you don't really have shelter, maybe just enough to survive. But that's not really what you mean, right? You're probably living in what's like a pretty good world, maybe indefinite lifespan.
So for emulation, so I have this book, The Age of M, which is about this scenario. And again, book presentation. And they mostly live and work in virtual reality, and it's just cheap for virtual reality to be completely luxurious. So everywhere they look, it's all beautiful and gorgeous and glimmering and shiny and friendly and welcoming. And every food they taste is a wonderful mixture of flavors. And when they sleep on a bed, it's terrible. It's just maximally comfortable because all those things are crazy cheap. But they do need to be working most of the time. That's the margin on which, if working 80% if they work a certain percentage of the time, but they could work more, well, then the population would just increase until the point where they really couldn't work more. So they would be working pretty much as many hours as they could, but we all know, in fact, that humans need breaks to be productive. And so they would have those breaks because that's what makes us productive. So they'd have, breaks every hour and break at lunch and break in the evening and breaks on weekends. And because that's, in fact, what makes humans maximally productive. So, and there would also just be variation in terms of, look, the subsistence thing goes at sort of the lower end of the productivity scale. But if they just vary in productivity, the higher productivity ones, they just get more slack. And so they can have more free time. And so, I think I calculated roughly a 6% slack or something like that, that they would be maybe within 6% of needing to work, that much in order to survive. And maybe they don't work as much because they each have a bit of slack because there's variation.
But why would we let that situation happen? I mean, we had Malthusian situation for a lot of history, and now we don't have it. Why would we do that? Why would people allow people to make copies of their minds, for instance, if it's going to lower their wages? Why would we not want to control our population?
As you know, the basic fact about humanity is that we haven't really voted on or chosen much of anything in terms of our long-term trajectory or changes, right? For almost every technology that's ever appeared, we didn't vote on whether that should appear. It appears if anybody wants it, regardless of whether other people don't want it. That's been the history. And we tend to, mostly neglect the effects of what we do on other people. And sometimes we can coordinate to limit that. But the question here is, how much coordination would be required to prevent this? And are we up to the task of doing that? And, is that worth it, all things considered? And I got to say, the world controlling population growth is a pretty big ask. Many people have suggested over the years, but it's actually pretty hard to do. And require a pretty central, pretty authoritarian, intrusive government to manage controlling everyone's population growth. And that can just go wrong in a lot of ways. Once they're controlling that, they're probably going to control other things too. Well, once they have the power to control population and fertility, they probably would use that power for many other things. And then plausibly, again, are we even capable of, or do we want a world government? If these are local governments, will a local government that tries to control fertility and limit its population, how will that do in competition with other governments that in places that don't? If they limit their productivity possibilities too much, they will just get outcompeted. And so they'd have to be careful about that. Some places may well do that, but that's in the space of what sort of regulations will our descendants adopt that hurt their long-term competitiveness, but still make local people feel like their lives better. That's certainly something that has happened and will happen to some degree, but the longer a time frame you look at and the larger a space, I think the more competitive pressures matter. So this is a key thing about biological selection. So, culture and DNA have been built on this key idea of natural selection for a long time. If you just say, look, natural selection doesn't tell me what to do today. I don't have to work today. I can do anything I want today. Who cares about natural selection? Well, that's true for a day, maybe even for a week. But the longer a time scale you look at, the more that these constraints impose on you. And that's true for our entire species and the descendant of our civilization. That is, we have a lot of freedom in the short run, especially if we're rich and just have some extra wealth. And we can use that freedom in a lot of different ways. But the longer a time scale you look at selection pressures, the stronger they are. And so if you're trying to win in competitions that might take 10,000 years, and there's some other competitor out there maximally trying to win on the 10,000 year time scale, well, you have to be pretty close to their standard of behavior to have any chance of being at all in their ballpark in 10,000 years, because these things just compound and compound over longer timescales. So the key fact about biological competition or even business competition is the longer a time scale you look at, the fiercer competition really is. You might not notice it on the short time scale, but if you're actually playing a competitive game on a long scale, you are held to pretty strict standards because there will just be this very strong effect over long times.
Yeah, but I don't think it necessarily requires a centralized agency, and I think a world government, as we say, would be probably a pretty horrible thing, even if it started off just to control population. But already we're seeing, without any central control, in fact, with governments trying to do the opposite, population is slowing down, and it's like it's going to shrink. This seems to be a cultural thing. And people in Europe apparently like more leisure time rather than
right. But now you were talking about brain emulations. What if we suddenly were able to make lots of brain emulations? Now the technology for growing the population becomes much easier. That is, it would, even with AI or brain emulations, it's just possible mechanically to grow the population very fast. And so then the question is, who limits that? Who stops that? So obviously with humans today, it's very slow and expensive to grow people, and that's why we're not growing them very fast. But in an alternative technology, it could be very cheap and fast to grow the population.
Right, but presumably if we have rights to our emulations, then I might say, well, I don't want any copies of me made.
And then maybe not, but anybody out there who chooses to make lots of copies of them, the population of the world increases as a result, and the wages fall as a result. So when you're in a world where the marginal, the number of people affects the marginal wage, then it takes anybody growing the population to lower wages down for everyone.
But I don't see how that follows, Robin, because obviously population's grown a lot over the years, and yet wages have gone up. We're vastly wealthier. Why?
Because we haven't been able to grow the population fast, right? But like certainly 1,000 years ago, the growth rate was so slow that we could grow the population fast, and that's why people lived at near subsistence wages. Like for the most of human history, people lived at subsistence wages because of this robust process by which population could grow faster than wealth, and so wealth per person falls until the lowest point it can sustain. And that's sort of standard economic analysis that I think is roughly right. But I think we're about out of time.
Yeah, we better wrap up here. We could go on talking a lot longer probably. but it'd be good to have you back at some point. Well, thank you very much, Robin. It's very stimulating.
And of course, I should say I'm a big fan of biostasis and all the work that people like you do to make it happen. Even though it's a tiny industry with little revenue, there's at least an industry there and people making the advances they can given the limitations they have.
And as you said early on, I think it's a really important point. This is something you can do today. You don't have to wait for someone to invent
Exactly.
life extensions. Is that something you can do today? So, in some sense, when I get a bit judgmental about people in the life extension community, I say, "Do you have biostasis arrangements? If not, why not?"
Right.
Yeah. All right.
And then you
Well,
could join the two of us in an interesting future, perhaps, if it all works
help
out.
us create a culture that we need to make this survive. I'm going to come back to that topic a lot, and since
Well,
that's your
good.
current focus, I'll be talking to you more about that, I'm sure.
I hope so.
All right. Well, thank you very much, Robin.
Thank you.
Okay, I'm trying to figure out how to stop the recording. Oh, there we go.
There's a record button at the top.